It's Dr. Joseph Lamb.
The microbiome is everything that we live with within our bodies.
Who's running the show with that many microorganisms?
There's 70 to 100 trillion living cells in a human being. There is crosstalk between our immune systems and the bacteria.
Lipopolysaccharide. That is the toxic element that harmful bacteria or pathogenic bacteria.
But we have microbiomes on our skin. We have microbiomes in our lungs.
Welcome to The Other Side of Medicine, a trusted source for education, not medication, for 35 years. In every episode of The Other Side of Medicine, we deliver health information your doctor won't tell you about. My guests are the nation's leading health experts in science-based natural medicine, physicians, authors, researchers, and clinicians. We believe natural medicine should be first, drugs and surgery last, and so we promise to deliver you the next generation of health information built on three principles: common sense, science, and cooperation with nature.
Tonight, we are very privileged to having a special guest on our program, and it's Dr. Joseph Lamb. And we are, again, very privileged to have him on the program. Dr. Lamb completed his bachelor's degree in biology at the University of Virginia, his graduate education at the Medical College of Virginia, and his internal medicine residency at Presbyterian University of Pennsylvania Medical Center. And his board certified is in both internal medicine and holistic medicine, integrative medicine. Dr. Lamb is the primary investigator in over 75 clinical studies. He's edited several books, authored book chapters, including 3 on osteoporosis, 1 for the textbook of functional medicine, and an authored and co-authored academic papers and website presentations on a variety of functional medicine topics. Currently, he's working on a textbook of vascular biology, which he co-authored, and it's going to press, I guess, gather soon. He is the president of the Commonwealth Consultants Foundation, a regionally recognized Middle Atlantic charity charged to provide unique educational and social experiences and opportunities for economically deserving children and young adults. Dr. Lamb is the owner of the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Center by Metagenics in Gig Harbor, Washington. Dr. Lamb, welcome to The Other Side of Medicine.
It is great to be here.
Well, we are honored to have you here.
Afternoon.
Yeah, well, that's good. How's the weather out there in Washington?
We have been really fortunate. We've had sun this week.
Well, that's nice. Well, it's always nice to have sunshine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I was looking at your website, and I saw a quote by John Muir, and I love Muir Woods, and I just had to read this. And this is a quote that he has on his website. It's so beautiful. I want to read this quote right now. "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves." Dr. Lamb, I absolutely love that quote. I'm gonna use that over and over again. I just absolutely love it.
It really is a great quote, and it speaks to that connectedness with community and the larger community of the world that we live in, the resonance that we have with everything that's living, and our responsibilities to give back and to be cognizant of and to live in balance with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, succinct way to put that. And it's just so poetic, but it has so much depth to it. So it's really special. So tonight we're going to be talking about the microbiome, and we're going to really dive a little bit deep into it. And so could you give us a little bit of an insight? What is the microbiome, and how does it affect our health?
Yeah, I mean, the quote was a great lead-in when you think about it, because the microbiome is everything that we live with within our bodies. if you look at a human being, there's 70 to 100 trillion living cells in a human being, of which about 10 to 15 trillion are human. The rest are bacteria and yeasts, little parasites, maybe a few worms. A minority of us have little mites even that live on our eyelashes and crawl up and down. They're microscopic. We can't see them. I mean, we are ourselves, the community, at balance with a larger world, right? So
it reminds you who's running the show with that many microorganisms.
Yeah. Admittedly, the number gets us thrown off a little bit because bacteria can be 50 times smaller than a human cell. So, mass-wise, we're predominantly human, but still, if we took away everything that was human, we'd cast a shadow. So, tonight we're specifically talking about the gut microbiome, what's in our gastrointestinal tract from our mouth down to our anus. But we have microbiomes on our skin. We have microbiomes in our lungs. We have microbiomes, women have them in their vaginas. We have, it's referring to the populations of bacteria and other organisms that we live with that are in communication with us. We're truly a neighborhood.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Does everybody have the same microbiome inside the gut?
We don't actually. When you look at the microbiome and you split it out, and it's really been one of the advantages in the last few years with a genetic technique called polymerase chain reaction, we can look a lot more broadly. We can identify down to the species level many different phylums worth, phylums kind of being extended families of bacteria that are all interconnected. And you can go, species, families, or phylums, families, species. We can get down to the species level of identifying things now because of the genetics. And when that work has been done, it's been basically shown that all of us share about a 50% base. If we looked, there's like 50% that we would all have. When you get past that 50%, that's where we start getting into the uniquenesses that are influenced by early life factors and then influenced by the diet that we eat, the medications that we take, whether we've had antibiotics, whether we're on immune suppressants, toxins, all of those pieces.
How many species of microbiomes do we have available living inside the gut in different individuals? How do they identify?
Yeah, I would say it's in the thousands, but I don't specifically know that answer off the top of my head.
I think it's over 5,000 actually.
Yeah, it is well more than we ever see on any sort of clinical report.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the Microbiome Project? That's really changed the trajectory of how medicine is looking at the gut now. And could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, it's fascinating when you think about it, going back, to the time, of Hippocrates, and then going forward to the 1800s with Eli Mechnikov, the Russian physiologist. We have known about the bacteria that live with us in the gut. And, and the statement that death begins in the colon is one that goes back at least to the 1800s. And it's referring to, that process of, even before we knew there were bacteria there, we knew that something was going on in our gut that contributed. And a long history in integrative and naturopathic medicine of recognizing that digestion and absorption and excretion played an intimate role in our health. And, the term leaky gut referred to the integrity of the gut lining. And that term has been going back, and even the microbiome term going well back into the 1980s. But it was only with the advent of newer techniques that the Human Microbiome Project could start identifying all these bacteria. Prior to the genetic techniques, we were limited to what we could culture out. And given that many of these bacteria, they're living in our colons, they're living in a relatively oxygen-poor environment. They're not aerobic bacteria. A lot of them are anaerobic or facultative anaerobic bacteria. So, you take them out, and an oxygen-rich environment was potentially toxic for them. So we weren't really able to culture them. But, coming through the 1990s, recognizing the word and the more traditionally accepted traditional medical term of intestinal hyperpermeability as opposed to leaky gut, and the recognition that there is crosstalk between our immune systems and the bacteria that are there, even the friendly bacteria, and that in that crosstalk, just like the crosstalk that takes place between our cells and our nervous system, Candace Pert's book, Molecules of Emotion, the presence of DNA, the presence of neurotransmitters, us responding to components from the bacteria, inflammation of the blood vessel, particularly after a meal if there's leaky gut because of lipopolysaccharide, which is cell wall component. It really is a very remarkable back and forth interaction that we have with, and typically, when we're talking on this level, we're talking about the bacteria, the symbiotic bacteria, the ones that do things for us, or the commensal bacteria, the ones we just kind of live with, or the dysbiotic bacteria, the ones that have the potential for causing harm.
Yeah, you mentioned the lipopolysaccharides. Just for our listening audience, that is the toxic element that harmful bacteria or pathogenic bacteria spit out or spew out or excrete, just like we excrete, microorganisms excrete as well. They poop too.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about right there. Listen, is there a connection between the type of bacteria that a baby gets exposed to at birth and the microbiome that they develop later in life, and how that affects their health?
Right. Oh, absolutely. Basically, babies are born relatively sterile. And, yes, there can be bacteria in the uterus, but it's a very small amount. If there's a lot of bacteria in the uterus, then we're already talking in an infection and problems. But the moment the baby enters the birth canal, they get inoculated with the bacteria that were in the birth canal. And, because their mouths are open and they're coming through, and those bacteria will go down and populate the colon. And the mother's vaginal microbiome has been influenced by her own colonic microbiome from her colon and anus. So in a sense, we're inheriting mom's microbiome. And in a lot of cases now, there are studies that show definite differences between babies who are born by cesarean section and don't go through the canal and children that do. And in some institutions, it's standard practice to inoculate even a C-section baby with mom's vaginal contents.
So if they don't get exposed to the mother's, vaginal microorganisms, and I call that, by the way, the baby's first baptism. They get baptized and come into that birth canal with those microorganisms. But if they don't, right, then they could develop basically what they're getting exposed to, what's in those practitioners in that delivery room, what kind of bacteria they have on their skin. And that's right, what's supposed to be going inside the gut, right?
Yeah, I mean, or any exposure. I mean, we're suddenly exposed not just to what's coming from a practitioner, but what's going to come from a family member being held or skin one when they're suckling on mom's breast, breastfeeding, or what's anywhere. I mean, the interesting thing is our environments are rich in bacteria. When you try to do studies looking at lipopolysaccharide in blood, one of the things that's so difficult about it is getting test tubes that don't have lipopolysaccharide in them, right? The blood collection tubes that are sterile enough that they don't have, bacterial cell wall components in them. So yeah, all sorts of influences like that. And then, to carry forward your point, the difference between breastfeeding and non-breastfeeding is going to greatly influence what goes on in that regard. And then, really a lot of changes take place in that first year as the immune system becomes online, becomes stronger, starts paying attention to what's there. Influences, are there antibiotics given early on? Influences like at what point child starts eating, and what it is that they're eating and what those conditions are like. We recognize the hypothesis, the kind of the clean hypothesis in terms of some of the atopic diseases like asthma and eczema, and did we get exposed to dirt just as children and have enough immune stimulation? So there's all of these factors. But it's interesting to note that by the time we're 2 years old, we've kind of bookmarked what our internal environment's going to look like to a certain extent. Our immune system calls that normal for us. And there's some back and forth, but that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. So there's research that shows that the children who are born C-section have a higher incidence of, as you said, the asthma and other types of dermatitis and other problems. Is there other problems that you know of that is triggered by those inability to get the good bacteria from the mother?
There's some thoughts that perhaps some of the autoimmune conditions.
Interesting. I never heard that.
Yeah. So I mean, it is, but it's, no one has drawn deep connections yet to that.
We're just at the beginning stages of this whole thing, but it's really interesting. It's intriguing to see how these things are showing up. Early studies are showing up, and it's quite promising to know that we can make a difference by preventing these things. Especially, you said, if we can inoculate the baby early on, even if they had a C-section. I know a lot of birthing centers will allow the parents to be able to take some of the mother's fluids and rub it on the baby's head and maybe put it into the mouth. They allow that as well.
Right.
For that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's really people taking a proactive role in their healthcare, because a lot of doctors don't really understand the impact these things have on the infant and the child later on. So I think it's really behooves people to investigate, do a little bit of reading, research, getting some information from experts like you, and being able to know that they can impact things on their own by making suggestions to their physicians.
Yeah, I think, we've reached an interesting point in medicine. The challenge is the stress on the system in terms of demand and the number of practitioners who have exited the field in the last couple of years have led to some interesting conflicts. And you're right, patients or a close family member for a patient has to be their own best advocate in many regards these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about how children who don't have these healthy bacteria that they are actually inoculate with, either through the birth canal or through other means by uh, perhaps, doing some supplementation from after they've been born a little bit later. Could you talk a little bit about how children are prone to like ear infections and throat infections? Because that seems to be predominant today. So many doctors are just dishing out antibiotics like candy anymore, and patients are demanding it, as a matter of fact, too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the difficulties is, obviously the concern about giving lots of antibiotics is that we have concerns that we're creating antibiotic resistance, right? We're creating bacteria. We're treating people who don't actually have bacterial infections, or we're subtreating them because people don't finish their prescriptions, and some bacteria are being exposed to antibiotics that didn't necessarily need to be exposed to antibiotics, and thus having genetic mutations take place that allow them to gain resistance to the antibiotic. And probably one of the big kickers in that regard is just how much antibiotics we give to livestock and the such like, and the influence on bacteria and some of the soil-based organisms. But that all said, we do have the potential for disrupting our immune systems, or disrupting our microbiome and the interaction with our immune systems when we give an antibiotic. And a lot of people will, at this point, and I don't treat children, I treat adults. So I'm not treating little ones with ear infections at 1 and 2 years old. But, certainly for adults, either during or perhaps just after, based upon their own personal medical history, will supplement with, a probiotic. And they go across a spectrum of, what you can do. People, the big classes are like bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. The lactobacillus being the family name nowadays for what we used to call acidophilus. And, other big categories include, the bacillus family species, and they're popular these days because they're actually able to form a spore. So they become a little bit more resistant. They develop this tight cell wall around them that protects them against stomach acid, and also protects them from drying out, like in your bottle or in a medical food or a protein supplement. And so a lot of people are also very interested in supplementing with bacillus, and the big category in that regard is bacillus coagulans. But
what I've seen in my practice over the years, I've actually seen a lot of infants and young children that have had repeated ear infections or throat infections, or problems like atopic dermatitis and those kind of conditions. I've seen where, especially with the infections that the doctors keep on treating antibiotics over and over again, that they really are not addressing the real problem, which oftentimes is, as you mentioned earlier, leaky gut, even in the baby or the infant, and they end up with food sensitivities, which are very common today. And I think there's a real problem there that the doctors are not getting to the cause, and
right.
Just repeating these antibiotics is complicating the issues even more, because even one dose of antibiotics can really disturb the microbiome, sometimes for a lifetime. Would you comment on some of those things?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is, like, in terms of a leaky gut, what we're basically saying is that the connections between the cells, where one cell touches the next cell, those connections aren't as tight. The tight junctions don't hold them together as tight. And so they open up a little bit. And you can have the translocation through those openings of either partially digested food or bacteria, or like LPS is cell wall components, lipopolysaccharide is cell wall components of the bacteria. And if you get fairly intact proteins crossing that barrier, you can develop an immune response, kind of a food hypersensitivity, not a classic allergy from the IgE perspective, which is typical of anaphylaxis or the such like, but instead it's a hypersensitivity reaction based upon antibodies binding to the food that gets through. And those sorts of things lead to stimulation and inflammation, and lead to like immune dysfunction. So conditions like asthma associated with a little localized inflammation and bronchospasm, or recurrent otitis, which may just be more of a serous, like a fluid-based thing. It's not actually infected, but it's a collection of fluid kind of in a localized inflammatory response. Some of these things, you need to take away that leakiness, and you need to drop those antibody levels to make the child healthier. Or even in the same situation for adults, because in many cases, as adults, we grow and grow and grow, and our guts get more and more insults, or we've killed off some of the friendly bacteria, and some of the things that we don't think of as friendly. All of us have potentially a little bit of yeast in our colon, and one of the bad actors in that regard is Candida albicans. But having a little bit of Candida.
Before you move into that, Dr. Lamb, if I may, for our listening audience's benefit, because you're a researcher, you've got so much knowledge. I really like to really hone it down to a level people can understand, if I may. So what Dr. Lamb is talking about is when the infant has these tight junctions that separate some of the undigested food particles that are larger than normal, could end up going and leaking through these tight junctions that open up a little bit, and they go inside, and they're not supposed to be getting in there, and the body perceives that as a foreign substance, and the immune system reacts, and then it causes what we call a delayed response, which is definitely different than the typical allergy. And so people then, or babies, will have ear infections and inflammation. Some, like he said, sometimes not an infection, it'll be inflammation and fluid buildup. And the doctor treats with antibiotics, which then complicates the things more, because it's going to then kill off some of the beneficial bacteria and leave spaces for the harmful bacteria, like Doctor mentioned, that spew off toxic elements, lipopolysaccharides. Those are toxins from the bacteria, and then that complicates even more. So I just wanted to did I kind of summarize that okay?
You did. The interesting thing is that when little newborns are born, they have relatively leaky guts. And part of that is so that they can absorb intact proteins, immunoglobulins, from their mom's breast milk, and prime their immune system to protect them while they're gaining the benefit of mom's knowledge of what the infections are out there in the world, while their immune system is getting primed and ready, but they're getting a ready supply of defense molecules. And after a few days, as the breast milk changes and as the colostrum, it goes from being relatively colostrum rich to being a denser, more nutrient based breast milk over the course of 24, 48 hours and going onward. But as that change takes place, the junctions tighten up.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point to be made there. And talk about that colostrum, how important that is as well, because I think a lot of people miss that understanding of how much of an impact that has on the baby's or the infant's health.
Yeah, well, not just on the baby's health. there are medical foods that have products from, people have crafted, they're not sourcing necessarily colostrum, but they've identified the proteins that are present that are signal actually into the cells to tighten up those junctions. And, and you can give other immune globulins that help tighten those junctions. And there are a number of the nutritional supplement companies have medical foods or functional foods or various powders to help with that balance. But you're exactly right. There are signaling molecules in that colostrum that play a role. And indeed, certain peptides, certain protein chains, one that's like a proline rich, rich in the amino acid proline, called colostrin, actually seems to have the ability to calm down inflammation in the brain and have benefits late in life for cognitive dysfunction. There is constant crosstalk going on between our immune systems and our guts.
Very interesting. So leaky gut has become a term that a lot of people are tossing around. I know that early on, I was talking about the leaky gut and increased intestinal permeability. That's the medical terminology that's used. But I was talking about it on my radio program 25 years ago.
Right.
And doctors in the medical community used to call it up and challenge me and say, well, what are you talking about? There's no such thing. And now it's becoming quite prolifically written about in medical journals. Could you comment about that just a minute, how things have shifted?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you go back to the early days of functional medicine, people like Sidney Baker, Leo Gallen, Jeff Bland, David Jones, Joe Pizzorno, that whole group, and, look at the naturopathic traditions and roots, and, leaky gut has been talked about. And you're right. I mean, for a long time, you say leaky gut, and a gastroenterologist would look at you and go, stay back, but if you look at the references, and you still don't see a ton of articles in the medical literature referencing leaky gut, but if you look at the number of literature references to intestinal hyperpermeability, it's been a parabolic curve in terms of the steepness, starting in the mid-90s and coming forward. And Alessio Visano, in the work that he did, showing zonulin as one of the proteins that controls that tight junction, that was instrumental work. And, he was originally at the University of Maryland when he did his work. And after he got attention for his work, Harvard recruited him and brought him there. So, it's a big shift in what we think. There's still a lot of doctors out there who, if they hear the term leaky gut, will do this. And a lot of them aren't familiar with the cutting edge gastroenterology positions that there is. But, I think we're coming to it a little bit down the road in our conversation. But, just what we eat influences what that situation is in terms of our leaky gut.
So let's talk a little bit about a topic that is really on the minds of many millions of Americans, and that's weight loss and weight gain. Americans are obsessed with the whole idea of losing weight. They're going on all kinds of crazy diets, and every time a new diet comes down the pike, people just jump right on it, and they're losing the weight and putting it back on. It's a vicious cycle. Is there any connection between the bacteria, the gut microbiome, and weight loss?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually kind of interesting because if you think about it, the microbiome, we talked a little bit about how it's relatively fixed by age 2, but there are a lot of influences on it. The foods we eat, not just from the content of, fat content or sugar content, but, the fiber content, for example, and fiber being what these bacteria live on and grow on, and it influences which strains grow. But it's also the signaling molecules that are in food, that are the phytonutrients that are in plants. And studies have been done showing that, for example, with some of the bariatric surgeries, the weight loss surgeries, you can have fairly profound changes in the gut microbiome because you've changed the nutrient stream, you've changed the pH of the nutrient stream, you've changed the immune response, so the microbiome changes, and there are bacteria associated. The whole phylum of the Firmicutes is associated. If you've got more of those compared to the Bacteroidetes, a high ratio, you've got a predisposition to getting more calories out of your food, and hence being in a position where you could be more prone to become obese. And studies have been done where you take lean mice and give them, inoculate them with the gut microbiome of a fat mouse, and they become fat. And similarly, if you sterilize a heavier mouse's microbiome and then inoculate them with a lean one, you can see weight loss. So there are a lot of parts there. And interestingly enough, you can, the lipopolysaccharide that we talked about in terms of, stimulating, inflammation. If you take a mouse and, feed them a high-fat diet, they have higher levels of lipopolysaccharide in their bloodstream and they gain weight. If you feed them a low-chow diet, a low-fat diet, the kind of traditional diet, but put lipopolysaccharide into their bloodstream, they'll gain weight even on the low-cal diet.
So the microorganisms, they isolated some microorganisms that in animal studies that would actually help in that lowering the calories, not the calories, but burning the calories.
Well, affecting the balance, reducing inflammation, perhaps having alterations in the metabolism of the short chain fatty acids and the such like. Bifidobacterium lactis B420, for example, is a strain of bacteria that has been associated with reductions in obesity and alterations in the colonic microbiome, and hence weight loss. And
could you talk about some of the research that's done with Akkermansia, the muciniphila?
Yeah, I mean, that has been that's another bacteria that's gotten a lot of recent attention. And if we don't have enough of it, we have the potential for being more obese. And, a vegetarian diet, feeding it the right, basically fibers, lead us to be in a place where those levels are higher and we're leaner.
So is there any supplementation that you can take as a probiotic capsule or pill or powder that can actually help to increase the population of Akkermansia? I know that early on they said there wasn't, but is there anything that can people?
I haven't looked lately. I know, for example, there are nutritional supplement companies that sell the Bifidobacterium lactis B420 is a strain that's had benefit in that regard. I haven't seen, but I haven't looked in the last 6 to 12 months, but I haven't seen a strain for I haven't seen a strain for Akkermansia as a nutritional supplement at the moment.
Could you talk about the foods that people could eat to help to increase the population of we're going to call it AK, not Akkermansia. We're just going to call it AK so people could comprehend it and be able to wrap their heads around it. The Akkermansia or AK, are there foods people can eat to help to increase that population of that particular species?
Yeah. Getting some of the, resistant starches that, are broken down by the bacteria. They're not resistant to digestion by the bacteria. They have, two effects. Number one, the starch leads to slower emptying of the gut, and so satiety for a longer period of time. But then they have the benefit of promoting the growth of the friendly bacteria. And so, you want to look for a resistant starch, and there's resistant starches in a number of the vegetables that we can eat. Really, the average American, eating kind of the standard American diet, and I'm sure someone on your show before has used the acronym SAD for Standard American Diet, gets 5 to 10, grams of fiber a day, and we should be in the 25 to 30 range for that. And, to get there, from a dietary approach, you need to be thinking about, 5 to 6 servings of veggies a day. If it's finely chopped, then maybe half a cup is your serving size. But if it's bigger, like broccoli florets or the such like, or if it's leafy vegetables, you should be talking a cup's worth, on a daily basis.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Dennis Burkett's work, and the indigenous tribes of Africa would get up from 100 to 150 grams of fiber per day. And so we're getting a paltry 5 to 10, and they're recommending 25. I mean, I think it's pretty amazing that people could eat that little of fiber and expect to be healthy. We have to really ramp that up. And I believe it's pretty easy to do if you start eating a plant-based diet. All the evidence from my research, I'd like to have you talk about yours as well, but the plant-based diet, particularly the Mediterranean diet or the Blue Zone diet, it's got so much evidence to prove that that plant-based diet increases the population of the beneficial bacteria. And yet we have people today that are promoting everything from paleo to keto to now carnivore diets, which it's hard for me to comprehend that we're going to those extremes and we're walking on thin ice when we do those kind of things. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, to me, a big portion of what's best for us is what have we been doing for a long time. And if you look at hunter-gatherer communities, and sometimes people refer to that diet as a caveman diet, and we end up with modifications of that diet, like Atkins, right? We call it high protein, high fat, right? But at the end of the day, our ancestors, at the end of the average hunting day, it probably wasn't our ancestors bringing home a mastodon every day. It was probably a mastodon coming home and saying, honey, it was another bad day at the office. I had to step on 10 humans, sort of thing. And the gathering played a significant role in what we ate. And the foods were significantly different, right? There wasn't anything that was high glycemic for our ancestors. Even the starchy things were different. Corn wasn't, a foot long, right? Corns were little tiny things. Potatoes were little tiny things. I mean, we have inbred our food to be completely different. We have this strong drive towards sweet, right? We really like sweet foods. That drove our ancestors to eat a lot of fruit when it was available in front of them. Because, if anyone who's lives in the wild knows that if you walk up to a fruit bush, like a blackberry bush today, and eat some blackberries, and you come back tomorrow because you left some for tomorrow, they may not be there. The birds or the bear or the deer could well have gotten there before you did. So you have a drive to eat those things, but there weren't that many of those things. And now, we eat diets that are very high in carbohydrates and very high in fats. There's a study by Pendiala that from LSU that basically showed if you get over 100 grams of fat a day, 125 grams of fat a day, get up in that range, you're going to create a leaky gut, and you get a double whammy if you're getting a lot of sugar in.
Mm-hmm. So can we shift for a minute and talk a little bit about the saturated fat and its connection to the microbiome, specifically with the TMAOs and that whole connection? I'd like to have you address that a little bit and how it affects heart disease.
Yeah, well, TMAO is triethyl monoamine N-oxide. And it's basically a breakdown compound of L-carnitine, which is an amino acid found in meat and eggs, and a breakdown product of like lecithin. And, and these are a consequence of eating high protein, high fat diets. And the TMAO, which is a metabolite, a bacterial metabolite of those foods, seems to be associated with increased risk for heart disease. Now, is it a consequence of having dysbiosis and having the wrong bacteria, or is it a consequence of eating the wrong foods? And
the Cleveland Clinic has done some research in that and shown it's actually the saturated fat actually increases the TMAO.
Right. May increase the TMAO that you measure in the bloodstream because it increases the intestinal permeability of it. And it's a multifactorial problem. I guess my point is we shouldn't throw away eggs because they're rich in L-carnitine, or we shouldn't throw away quality meats, but we should be very much thinking about what it is, the meat that we eat, and what that meat ate, right? Our ancestors just a couple hundred years ago, were eating, when they were eating beef, they were eating a relatively rich omega-3 ratio to omega-6. But because so much of our beef in the last 150 years is corn-fed on feedlots, we get a much higher ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So it's a pro-inflammatory fat pattern, and we lose the benefits of the omega-3s that we would have gotten in. Animals in the past were much leaner, and there's consequences to the fact that our beef isn't lean and our pork isn't lean. And that plays a role in terms of what goes on.
Going back to the blue zones, though, it's quite evident that the regions that the scientists from the National Geographic study that they did found that the blue zone regions, the populations, all of them eat a very low saturated fat, low animal protein, a very high plant-based diet, and they have the highest centenarians in the world, and they have the lowest incidence of chronic diseases. So it's quite obvious that the predominantly plant-based diet is the way to go.
Oh, absolutely. But I guess the point that I was trying to make was that so much of what we call our ancestors were, even when they lived in the Paleo period, were probably eating predominantly a plant-based diet, and they were eating animals that were eating a plant-based diet that was beneficial. For example, in the 7-country study that you were referring to, you look at the island of Crete and the people there, and they had a very low incidence of heart disease. And so people talked about them perhaps being an island where people ate a lot of fish, for example, right? It's an island in the Mediterranean. Well, the average person who lives on Crete actually doesn't eat a lot of fish, because fish is a luxury item, right? It gets sold and you make money on it. They actually end up eating a lot of pork. But interestingly enough, their pork is fed oranges from the trees, the cast off from the trees, and it's fed a lot of olives, the kind of damaged olives. Their pork had a different content because it was plant-based. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when we sit down to eat, we should be predominantly looking at a plate of vegetables, a limited amount of fruits, a good quality protein, and quality, as much raised like a wild animal as possible, as much omega-3 fats as possible, as relatively lean as possible. An animal that's having to hunt out and gather its food is going to be lean. An animal that's stuck in a cage, or the whole kind of concept of free-range chicken, when free range can actually be defined as, I have a concrete bunker that's a couple hundred yards long, but at one end I've got like half a size basketball court on it, and I've got a little door that is tiny that a couple chickens could fit through at a time, and all the food's inside in the dark, but they're not in cages inside, but they're all inside, and I feed them corn. That's a free range chicken. And, we're not doing ourselves any benefit. But, if you look for like pasture raised foods, if you look for free range beef, which has a different definition, we get different pieces, but still it should be the smallest portion of our dinner. And then the even smaller piece should probably be, the refined grains and the starchy vegetables.
Yeah,
we need enough calories to get us through the day, and we need enough healthy fats to get us through the day. But it's really the quality of the fats, the quality of the carbohydrates, and what else comes with them. Yeah,
the average American has got to stop eating all those refined carbohydrates, because they're just giving the harmful bacteria more sugar, and they're basically not allowing the beneficial bacteria to grow properly. So those whole grains and the vegetables and the high fiber, as you mentioned, getting the prebiotics. By the way, I wanted to mention that the Akkermansia, you can get increased population of those by eating things like pomegranate and kiwis and some green tea. Those are some things. And as you said, the slow carbohydrates. You mentioned glycemic, making sure that people are getting low glycemic. And for our listeners, that's making sure that you get the release of sugar slow with these carbohydrates. So you're getting the whole grains with the fiber, so it releases the sugar slowly. That's a low glycemic carbohydrate. And
absolutely
not getting the right carbs. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Lim. That's great. Could you talk a little bit about how your colleagues in the medical profession are perceiving this whole revolution that's taking place with the microbiome and the gut and how it's affecting our health? And how are they taking it? How are they accepting that?
Well, I think it depends on the individual practitioner and their focus. And obviously, it depends on, one of the scariest studies I ever read basically said the primary determinant of which blood pressure medicine you get from your doctor is related to the year your doctor graduated med school. Mm-hmm. So if that's true, old dogs don't learn new tricks. And, Dr. Jeff Bland, father of functional medicine, founder of the Institute for Functional Medicine, he's basically said paradigm shifts take 50 years because that's how long it takes for the guys who held the old paradigm to die off. Mm-hmm. So, I think we're in changing times, and I think people are recognizing the value of support, but you can still hear a lot of people say there's no double-blind placebo-controlled trial that demonstrates that. And my response to them would be, show me a double-blind placebo-controlled trial that had asked that question in their data collection, right? Mm-hmm. Were they trying to find that answer? And mm-hmm. I think that we're seeing changes. I see more people being told to take a probiotic when they're given an antibiotic. I see more people talking about fiber. I see people wanting to make differences. I still see a lot of reluctance to using botanicals for treating the microbiome or for treating overgrowths. Like if you have an overgrowth of bacteria on a stool study. But, one of the interesting pieces in that regard, we've had, there's this term big data that's gotten a lot of attention all across the scientific community and the business community, because big data allows you to find things in the data that wouldn't maybe be obvious to you. But in medicine, when we're talking about like P4 medicine, which is it is patient-centered, it is predictive, it's preventative, and it's participatory, right? In that preventative and predictive piece, getting more data lets you see some interesting things. And a guy named Larry Smarr, who, and I'm not giving away any personal health information here, he talks about it. He did his stool studies basically looking at his microbiome. He did it once a week for like a year. And what was interesting was some of the bacteria that we label as dysbiotic, right? When
we use the term dysbiotic, let's, for our listening audience benefit, that's just an imbalance in the good and bad bacteria.
Right. Well, dysbiotic is kind of referring to those bacteria that have the potential, if their numbers are big enough, to cause us harm. It's like the mean, nasty neighbor, right? If you have 3 fraternity boys living in the house down the street, maybe it's a little noisy sometimes, maybe someone drives a little fast sometimes, but if the whole fraternity gets kicked off the campus, then you've got the whole fraternity living down the street and the neighborhood just took a plunge. Mm-hmm. And, so it's, the 3 boys may be okay, 80 of them aren't. So when you're looking at populations, those potentially dysbiotic troublemakers, in the old days, go back 20 years, like you're talking about, some of us used to really pound on it. Like if you got a 4+ growth of a Klebsiella or a 4+ growth of Citrobacter, we'd be tempted to give a botanical or an antibiotic, a traditional antibiotic, to wipe that guy out. But, some of this big data suggests that we'd be much better focused at giving healthy prebiotic fibers restoring balance, eating fermented foods, eating the foods you were talking about to support akkermansia, all of those pieces, reducing our fat content, reducing simple sugars, and make the environment better so it favors the right bacteria.
That's very well said. Very well said. Well, we're running out of time. I have one more question I'd like to ask you. It's so intriguing, all the information you bring. I've just really been enlightened. I hope our audience really appreciates it. But I want to ask you one last thing. You've really provided so much benefit over the years to the functional medicine community. What would you like to be remembered for? What would you like your legend to be?
Michael Stone and I, and a number of other people, Lyra Heller, Susan Buell, Courtney Suter, Monique Klass, Jeff Bland, and David Jones wrote an interesting paper recently called Our Healing Journey. And it was a paper about people finding out what's important to them. So, and understanding how their bodies function so that they can make choices that they can sustain in the long term from a behavioral perspective. Mm-hmm. There, so many of our patients may be influenced by what we say, but unless it resonates with what's important, meaningful, and valuable to them, they're not going to be able to support making the changes that support their health. And we can't know what's important to someone else. We're not walking in their shoes. We may tell them we've helped a lot of people like you walk in shoes similar to yours, but you have to make the choices, and we have to help them see that, they're the authors of their stories. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an important piece of extending the functional medicine model into a transpersonal model of recognizing that every human being's worthy of respect and reverence.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Lamb, hopefully we can have you back in the future. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for all your insights. It's been a pleasure. Is there any parting thoughts you'd like to leave with?
I just hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving. And, as you eat that meal, don't eat it with guilt. Have the things that are pleasurable to you, but also make sure that you eat a lot of the things that we talked about today that'll help your microbiome.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
God bless you.
Okay, take care now. Good night, everybody. We'll be back next week on the other side of medicine, and we look forward. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Actually, we won't be back next week because next week, Thursday, is Thanksgiving. So we'll be back on the Thursday after that. So take care. God bless, and we'll see you then.